All right, everybody, welcome to chapter 13, excuse me. Remember, this time we're going to read the entire chapter, but we're going to focus on these three sections. So the purely competitive labor market, monopsony, and the bilateral monopoly. Those three sections you want to read a little bit more closely. So we'll talk about labor, wages, and earnings. So remember that wage, of course, is what we are paid for labor. We're in the resource market, so we have lots of different kinds of things. We got interest, you got rent, and you have profit. But like I told you before, we usually focus on labor, and therefore wage is what we're really going to be discussing here. Remember that there's a difference between the nominal wage and your real wage. Real wage, of course, refers to your purchasing power, and this is what you actually care about. Your nominal wage, nominal wage is instead just what you're paid, right? So it's this dollar value in today's money, which typically is not what we're actually that interested in. We want to know what we can buy. And then obviously there's the general level of wages, and this becomes, important for macroeconomic things about how effective certain policies are at increasing wages and that kind of stuff. So globally, you can see where the United States fits. Here we are. We've got, and this is obviously in 2007. It's getting a little outdated, but you can see that the United States is sort of in the middle in terms of hourly wage. There's definitely some countries that are higher. Productivity is incredibly important in terms of wage difference. So you can, and you guys all know this, you can make a great deal of money in the United States you're with very high wages, or you can have very low wages. And it depends, of course, on productivity. So since labor is derived demand, one thing you can do is increase your productivity. The other is to make yourself more valuable and to make the thing that your labor provides more desirable. So why is U.S. labor highly productive? Well, first of all, there's lots of capital. So like we talked about in the, how building in Mexico works with cement walls versus, the poured concrete. Here we have lots of capital. Where there aren't cement trucks, you can't use cement, obviously. Abundant natural resources, so there's lots of clean water, there's lots of arable land, there's lots of trees, all that kind of jazz. Advanced technology is present. Labor quality, right? So we've got high education, so it's a pretty skilled labor pool, and that's all part of those are all the things that contribute to the United States being a productive place. Now, on the average, long-run trends for real wages have grown. Okay, so what you're seeing here is this upward trend, and this is in real wage. So after we control for inflation, well, of course, what we're seeing is, supply, right, is here. So we are making more and more and more, and therefore it's important that demand, what we call aggregate demand in macroeconomics, is going up as well. Because clearly if we were just getting more productive and and demand for labor were staying the same, then our wage would be going down. So our productivity needs to go up, and then that's part of the reason that we can have these shifts in demand to absorb a larger population and everything else. So real wage has steadily grown, and we anticipate that it will continue to grow. Now, here's kind of an interesting thing. So what you'll notice is output per hour of work used to be below hourly compensation, but it no longer is. So in the 90s, of course, and what we notice about this, the 90s are when the internet really started to boom. So since then, we've noticed that as capital is doing more work, right, robotics and the internet and that sort of thing, now output, we are so much more productive than we used to be, and our wages are lagging behind. So the question is kind of, where is this going? And that, most people would say, is the amount of money or wealth that is being transferred to the owners of capital rather than laborers. So here you can see that laborers are making out well relative to owners of capital because compensation is above output, but that trend has reversed. So we're going to now talk about the competitive labor market. So this would be we could be even a little bit more correct and say the purely competitive labor market. So of course, the demand for labor is the sum of all of the individual firms' demand. So all of the schools in the MCC demand econ teachers, and when we add horizontally those different demand curves, then we get the full demand curve for econ teachers, right? So there's also a market supply of labor, which is upward sloping. We have competition among industries, which is part of the reason that we have this, but that makes it complicated and difficult sometimes to figure things out. We're still going to hire where MRP equals MRC, okay? So this right here becomes the most important. We're still going to hire where MRP equals MRC. As long as hiring another person, MRC, makes us more money than it costs us, MRP, then we're in good shape to continue hiring. Now, our purely competitive labor market, we know that MRP is the sum of all the individual, that MRP is the demand for labor, okay? And it's the sum of the MRP of all the individual firms, okay? So it's kind of the horizontal sum of this. And then the supply, of course, of the market, the intersection of supply and demand is going to give us our equilibrium. The equilibrium then dictates a wage. And that wage then transfers to the individual firm as a horizontal demand curve, okay? So, so what we see is as the wage rate moves up or down, it's going to intersect the downsloping MRP curve at a different point. And therefore, that's going to give us different quantities, okay? So if wage rates rise, okay, then the quantity will go down, okay? So should not be too terribly surprising because it's very similar to what we saw in pure competition in the product market, okay? And this is because we, in a purely competitive labor market, we can hire basically as many people as we want, right? At the same wage. But of course, that's not always going to be the case. And when it's not the case, we call it a monopsony, another weird word. You just got to get used to it. A monopsony is where the employer has buying power. So the characteristics of a monopsony are a single buyer of the labor, and labor has to be relatively immobile. This makes the firm a wage maker. So what that means is that we still have an upsloping supply of labor. So instead of our horizontal supply with our downsloping demand, now we're going to have an upsloping for the firm, okay, supply. So right here, now, if the firm wants to hire a greater quantity, then they're going to have to pay a higher wage. Okay, so if I want to hire this queue here rather than this queue here, then I'm going to have to pay the higher wage in order to do it. Okay, that means that MRC is going to be higher than the wage rate. And we did our activity in class where you guys were, where we plotted out the supply curve. And it's going to look something like this. So our downsloping MRP curve, and then we have the supply of labor. But if in order to hire more people, I have to pay more, then I not only pay more to the new person that I hired, but I also have to pay more to the old people. And that gives me an MRC curve that slopes upward even more steeply. Now, where is our equilibrium? So we're going to hire at the quantity where MRP equals MRC. So that's point B right here. And point B is going to tell us the quantity that we will employ. But notice it doesn't tell us anything about wage. That's really important. Just like in the product market, we had our downsloping demand curve and our more steeply downsloping marginal revenue curve. And then we had our marginal cost curve. And we know that the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, it told us Q, but it did not tell us anything. It didn't tell us anything over here on the price axis. Instead, we had to continue our line upward, and that gave us the price. Okay, likewise, this intersection does not tell us anything over here. Rather, we drop the line down to Q and where it intersects the supply curve rather than where it intersects the demand curve. Now that's going to tell us our wage rate. So this is the wage for a monopsony. Now over here, this right here, this is the competitive wage. If we have a purely competitive wage, then we're going to pay this and hire that Q. Okay, you see that? All right. Now, monopsonies will maximize profit by hiring a smaller number of workers. Okay, so if we go back here, they're not going to hire as many people. They'll hire fewer because they're going to maximize profits where MRP equals MRC, and they're going to hire fewer people, and then of course they're going to pay them less than they would, once again, in a purely competitive labor market. So a purely competitive labor market will pay higher wages and employ more people. Higher wages, employ more people than a monopsony. And the monopsony is exerting control, it's exerting power, and the way that it does that is by hiring fewer people and paying lower wages. The lower wages, of course, are what the businesses are more interested in doing. They would kind of hire, they don't care about the quantity as much, as long as the quantity maximizes profit. But of course, that lower wage is part of the reason that they can maximize profit that way. And since the monopsony is really the only place that these laborers can go to get a job, they can't look anyplace else. They're geographically immobile, and their skills aren't useful for other things. So that's what makes this realistic. So you've got some examples. A nurse maybe in a rural hospital. So if you work if you live in a rural area, there's maybe only one hospital where a nurse can work. So that nurse is going to take whatever wage the hospital pays. Professional athletes, likewise, your skill as a football player is really only useful playing professional football, right? So you're going to take kind of whatever they can pay. Now, of course, there's a little bit of competition because they can get traded around, but their best option is still going to be a teacher. And then teachers obviously can be in this situation, though I think of the three examples, it's the weakest of the three. Next thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about unions. And I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. We can talk about it more in class. So the demand enhancement model. So I would argue that this really isn't even a union model. The book talks about it that way. I get why they do, but I think it's basically just what everybody's trying to do. If you increase demand, then wages go up and more people get jobs. That just makes sense, right? So everybody's always trying to increase product demand because it's going to alter the prices of all the inputs. So, that one's just obvious. This is where it starts to get interesting. This is the craft union. And the craft union is one that you're probably familiar with. So it's the stereotypical like plumbers union or something like that. If you want to be a union plumber, you must join the plumbers union. And joining the plumbers union is difficult because what they're trying to do is to reduce the supply of labor. They do that by restricting immigration, by reducing child labor. That was really important, back when this all began. Throwing in compulsory retirement, so you can't, even if you're willing to work when you're 70, you get booted out, so you're not going to. And then obviously doing the shorter work week. It's sometimes also called exclusive unionism. That's another word for craft union. I'll always call it a craft union though. But here's the thing. Occupational licensing also is a form of the craft union. So doctors are actually one of the most effective unions out there, because I'm sure a bunch of you guys are going to go to college. You're all perfectly talented students. You're very smart. You would make great doctors, but there aren't enough spots for you. So everybody who wants to be a doctor simply can't, because you can't start a medical school without permission from the American Medical Association, which works as the de facto union. Okay, so don't just think that it's, plumbers unions. I always laugh at my doctor friends when they're complaining about unions and all that sort of stuff, when I would argue that, doctors are some of the most effective unions out there. But that's a story for another time. So here's how it looks graphically. So basically what craft unions do is they decrease the supply, which has the positive effect of raising wages, but the negative effect of decreasing the quantity of workers. Okay, and that's obviously a bit of a problem. That's why, there's always people out there who will do the plumbing in your house. They're not union, so they're cheaper. They'd probably prefer to be in the union because then they would get higher wages, but the union doesn't want them because that would then increase supply and they wouldn't be able to charge as much. Okay? Likewise, it's very difficult for somebody who went to medical school outside of the United States to come into the United States and be a doctor. And that's all part of this idea. If people could just get educated elsewhere and come over here, even if their education were perfectly sound, it's difficult to be educated in the United Kingdom and come to the United States. And I'm sure the doctors have all sorts of great reasons for that. But the effect is still the same. It raises wage and it decreases the quantity of labor. The opposite is an industrial union. So an industrial union is a situation where they try and get everybody, low skill, high skill, medium skill, they bring everybody into the union. And they basically, so auto workers are a clear example here, they basically then say, look, everybody who is involved in making a car, they're in our union. If you want to make a car, our union has to be involved. And what that does is it creates a situation like this, where we have a horizontal, supply curve for all intents and purposes, right? Because in the relevant area, it is horizontal. So the supply curve will keep going up after this. But basically what they say is we're going to raise the wage, and at that point, to whatever they raise it to, then you have this horizontal curve. So the good part is, once again, higher wages, but the bad part is fewer people employed. Okay? So both unions, the craft union and the industrial union, typically succeed in giving higher wages, but they typically then decrease, at least to some extent, they decrease employment. So do they work? And the answer is a pretty significant yes. Unions have higher wages, and there's almost no economists who will try and make the case that unions do not give higher wages. But they do give greater unemployment, because obviously when the MRC goes down, employment goes up. That shouldn't really surprise anybody. And of course, there's a tempering effect here, because the union workers eventually will stop asking for higher wages, because if they ask for unreasonably high wages, then a bunch of their union members will wind up being unemployed, right? So they can ask for more, but they can't ask for too much more, and that, you can argue, is good. Now, the last thing that we're going to cover in this chapter is the bilateral monopoly. So a bilateral monopoly exists when you have a monopsony and an inclusive union working together, which means there's a single buyer and a single seller. The situations are actually relatively common, but here's the thing. We don't know what's going to happen to wages. We can't tell. But I think we can argue that it is a relatively desirable thing, and you'll see it when we look at it graphically. So we have a monopsony, which means that your MRC is not going to be the same as your supply curve. Okay, so let's see what we get. All right, so the union, the inclusive union, negotiates a supply curve that looks like this horizontal supply curve. That's the key element of the inclusive union. If somebody wanted to pay up here, I'm sure the union would be more than willing to take it. What they will not allow to happen is for any wages along this part of the curve to be paid. So that's what gives you the horizontal curve. Now, again, we get the MRC curve that slopes more steeply upward because everybody who's going to get a job is going to work for the same firm. So the bilateral monopoly creates this situation. This is the wage that the employer wants to pay. This is the wage that the union wants to receive. But here's the crazy thing. What winds up happening is the two will negotiate, right? And whichever one does the better job negotiating will say where in this area the wage will wind up. But what can wind up happening is something where an increase in quantity. So right here, this tells you this lower amount, but you can wind up with additional people working, right? So maybe you have a situation like this, where wages are more than what the business wants to pay, less than what the union wants to receive. But here's the thing, you can wind up with more people being employed. So that's kind of the argument for the desirability of a bilateral monopoly. That's where we're going to stop now. We're going to talk about minimum wage in class, but we're not going to do that in the video. Thank you very much, gentlemen.